Hi everyone. I'm going to start off with a very new track I wrote. It's a story, and I wrote it around Anzac Day. I asked my friends to give me stories of maybe relatives or people they knew of that had been a part of the war, Anzacs or any other war. And one of my friends from high school got in touch after many years. I haven't seen him. And he told me this story about his grandfather, Colin, who served, he was an Anzac and he served in New Guinea. And when the war ended, he was then posted to a Japanese POW camp as they were bringing down the camps and sending everyone home because as far as everyone knew, the battles had ended. But probably this is quite a harrowing story, but I thought it was one that needed to be told. So Colin was a beautiful, kind man, and he hoped in some way that being in this camp and sending these soldiers back to their families, the Japanese soldiers who were earlier their enemies, back to their families, he'd find some peace, and that somehow all the madness he'd experienced would somehow ease a little bit. But he shared this story with his family a few years before he passed away. And what he found his biggest task in this POW camp when he was sending the soldiers home was keeping them alive, because the shame they felt to go home losing the war was so intense that they couldn't face their families. And I know it's a very sad song and a very sad story, but this beautiful man tried his hardest to bring some light and some joy to these men who were once enemies, had become friends. And he then helped them on these boats to go back across the Pacific to Japan, knowing full well that as much as he'd done all he could up until that point to keep them alive, many of them would jump ship rather than face the shame of returning home after losing the war. So I was really moved and really honoured and touched that Matt had shared this story with me. And his mother actually contacted me a few days after she heard the song, So This Is Colin's Daughter, and thanked me for, she said, I somehow managed to encompass this beautiful man and this harrowing experience in one song, and I want to share it with you all. This has not been played in public before, it's brand new, and I just thought this is a story we should all know and hold on to. So this is Away They Go, and it's about these brave Japanese soldiers who had a bigger battle to fight than the war at the end. He stood his post just watching over those men had been left in his care. He kept them close aside because he knew that their real fight was facing something they just couldn't bear. It seems that sweet old sound of freedom was ringing harsh within their ears. A prisoner of war, not wanting to leave the shore, 'cause in the light of day a sense of failure seemed so clear, and as he held them on the boat, he felt it slip away. There'd been a time when he had hoped that he'd find peace someday, and away they'd go over the Pacific. They were headed straight for home, and as he raised his hands, he wasn't waving off an enemy, he was farewelling his friends. 'Cause though the war was over and they'd done all they could, it was time to start their new life, but he knew they never would. So with their heads held low, away they go. And all he wanted was to help them, to show them they had come so far, that they were not to blame, but their bones were riddled with their shame, a shame that buried deep into their hearts. He'd always hoped that when that day had come, when someone called a victory, the loss of life would cease and he would finally find peace. But now he knew that day would never be. And in his heavy heart he knew, as they moved out of sight, there was no more he could do to help them win that fight. And away they go over the Pacific. They were headed straight for home. And as he raised his hands, he wasn't waving off an enemy, he was farewelling his friends. 'Cause now the war was over and they'd done all they could. It was time to start their new life, but he knew they never would. So with their heads held low, away they go. So I guess what we hold on to then is that one man's caring heart. Although he could not save those men, he was a light within the dark. And with their heads held low, away they go. And with their heads held low, away they go.